I remember the exact moment my mother died. It was 3:47 a.m. I know because I looked at my phone when the hospice nurse called. 3:47. That number would become a code for everything that followed, the beginning of lies, the moment my family decided who I was, and the turning point when I decided to become something none of them expected. The funeral was on a Tuesday. I wore black. I cried. I did all the things you're supposed to do when your mother leaves the world and takes half your identity with her. What I didn't know was that she'd left something else behind, something sealed, something that would prove my family had been playing a very sophisticated game, and I was never supposed to find out the truth. The lawyer's office smelled like old wood and older money. I sat in a leather chair that was probably more expensive than my car, my hands folded in my lap, still wearing the black dress from the funeral. 3 days had passed since Mom died. 3 days of people hugging me and saying things like, she's in a better place, and she wouldn't want you to suffer. None of them seemed to understand that better place or not, she was gone, and I was alone. The lawyer, Mr. Henderson, 70s, silver hair, reading glasses on a chain, opened a file folder. Inside were documents. So many documents, a will, an estate inventory, stock certificates, property deeds, things that suddenly mattered because they represented what my mother had spent her whole life accumulating. Your mother's will is quite straightforward, Mr. Henderson said, adjusting his glasses. She left the house to your brother Michael, the investment portfolio to your sister Rebecca, the savings account to both of them to be divided equally. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just watched his mouth form the words. And for you, Sarah, your mother left her personal effects, her jewelry box, her books, and a collection of her artwork. She also set aside $5,000 for personal items of sentimental value. $5,000. My mother had a net estate of approximately $1.2 million. I'd seen the breakdown on the papers he'd slid across the mahogany desk. I'd watched the numbers add up while he talked. And somehow, through simple arithmetic and a document with my mother's signature, a signature that had always looked like love to me, I was getting the equivalent of what she'd spent on a vacation to Italy in 1998. Is there something wrong? Mr. Henderson asked. No, I said quietly. No, nothing's wrong. But everything was. My life before the will was exactly what you'd expect from a woman of 34 with too much education and not enough direction. I had a master's degree in art history. I worked as a freelance curator for small museums and private collectors. I made decent money, not rich money, but enough to rent a one-bedroom apartment in Portland and buy good coffee and occasionally go out with friends on Friday nights. I was the middle child. Michael was 5 years older, the golden boy who'd become a tax attorney. Rebecca was 3 years younger, the pretty one who'd married a surgeon and had 2 perfect children who looked like they walked out of a catalog. And then there was me, Sarah, the thoughtful one, the one who called on Sundays, the one who drove out to see Mom every month, brought her flowers, sat in her kitchen while she told me stories about her marriage and her dreams and the things she regretted. The one who held her hand during chemotherapy. The one who was there at 3 in the morning when the hospice nurse called. Mom had always said I understood her in ways my siblings didn't. She said I had her soul, introspective, artistic, maybe a little too sensitive for a world that didn't reward sensitivity. She called me her favorite sometimes when the lights were low and it was just the two of us. She'd say it like a secret. Don't tell the others, she'd whisper, squeezing my hand. I won't, I'd promise. I never did. The day before she died, we had our last real conversation. She was fatting in and out, morphine making her dreamy and disconnected. But for about 20 minutes, she was lucid and looking directly at me. You're going to be okay, she said. No matter what happens, you're stronger than you know. Promise me you'll remember that. I promise, I said. My beautiful, brilliant girl, she whispered. You're going to do extraordinary things. I thought she meant after her death, when I'd finally have time and space to figure out who I was supposed to be. A gallery director, a museum consultant, Something that mattered, something that would have made her proud. I didn't know she meant something else entirely. The conversation with Michael happened 5 days after the reading of the will. He called me on a Thursday morning, casual, like he was just checking in. "Hey, Sarah, how are you holding up?" "Fine," I said, which was a lie. I wasn't fine. I was confused and hurt and spending a lot of time looking at my mother's jewelry box, trying to calculate if a pair of pearl earrings and a broken diamond watch were actually worth the rejection I'd felt in that lawyer's office. "Listen," Michael said, and I could hear the careful tone in his voice, the one he used when he was about to tell me something I wouldn't like. "I wanted to talk to you about the house." "What about it?" "Well, Rebecca and I have been talking, and we think it makes more sense to sell it rather than have me try to maintain it by myself. The market's good right now, and the money would be useful." "You're selling Mom's house." The words came out smaller than I intended. "Yeah, is that a problem?" It wasn't a problem. It was Mom's house. It had been Mom's to do with as she wished, and she'd wished to leave it to him. But something in the way he asked made me understand that he already knew it was a problem. He was asking anyway. "No," I said, "no problem." "Great, because we wanted to ask you something. Rebecca's been going through some boxes in the storage room, and she found a bunch of art supplies and supplies for that pottery wheel Mom kept in the garage. Rebecca thought maybe you'd want those." The pottery wheel. Mom had bought it 3 years ago, talked about taking classes, had made 2 ugly ashtrays before deciding she didn't have the patience for it. I'd made a joke about it, and Mom had laughed and agreed it was a stupid idea. "Sure," I said, "that would be nice." "Perfect. We'll have someone box it up. They can deliver it to your apartment sometime next week." After we hung up, I sat on my couch for an hour, staring at nothing. The pottery wheel. The jewelry. The $5,000. Pieces of my mother, doled out like she'd been a charitable organization with limited funds instead of a woman who'd raised 3 children and built a life. The real conversation came 2 weeks later. I was at Rebecca's house, drinking wine in her kitchen while she made dinner. This was a ritual we'd started after Mom got sick. Once a month, I'd drive to her suburban house with its perfect lawn and perfect kitchen, and we'd cook together while her children did homework at the dining room table behind us. It was supposed to be bonding. It was supposed to prove that we were a family that stayed close. "So I wanted to talk to you about something," Rebecca said, chopping garlic with unnecessary force. "And I want you to know that Michael and I have been thinking about this for a while." My stomach dropped. There was more. There was always more. "It's about Mom's will," she continued. "And honestly, Sarah, we're worried about you." "Worried about me? How?" "You're not married. You don't have stable income. You're renting that apartment and you don't have any real savings. And Mom knew that. She knew you struggled with money. She knew you'd made some choices that weren't always the most practical." I set down my wine glass carefully. "What are you saying?" Rebecca turned to face me, and I could see pity in her eyes. Genuine pity, like I was a wounded animal she was trying to help. "We're saying that Mom's will might have been made when she was sicker than we realized. And there are people, lawyers, estate consultants, who specialize in these situations, where a parent's judgment might have been compromised and the distribution might not have reflected what they truly wanted." "You want to challenge her will," I said flatly. "We want to make sure it was fair," Rebecca corrected. "Michael's taking on the burden of selling the house, managing the sale, paying capital gains taxes. And you need more help. We thought if we adjusted things slightly, made sure you had a real safety net." "That's very kind of you," I said quietly, "but it sounds like you already made your decision." "That's not fair," Rebecca said, but her voice was uncertain because it was fair. It was completely fair, and we both knew it. That night, I drove home with the pottery wheel and a complete understanding of what had happened. My mother hadn't written her will during her final illness. She'd written it years ago, back when she was healthy and clear-minded, and probably thought all her children would understand her choices. But something had changed. Maybe Michael had convinced her that he deserved more because he was a man and would need to provide. Maybe Rebecca had told her that my life was a mess and I needed to be protected from my own incompetence. Maybe my mother had simply been influenced by people who spent more time with her, who whispered in her ear about fairness and practicality and responsibility. Or maybe, and this was the thought that kept me awake at night, my mother had written a newer will, one that reflected what she'd really wanted, and someone had hidden it. I did what a lot of people do when they're hurt and confused. I made it worse. I called Michael and asked why he hadn't warned me about Rebecca's plans to challenge the will. He said he had nothing to do with it. I didn't believe him. I sent him an angry email laying out all the ways I'd been there for Mom while he was building his law practice and his perfect life. I said things about how she told me I was her favorite, which was both true and the most petty thing I could possibly have thrown in his face. He didn't respond. I posted something vague on Facebook about family and betrayal, which was immediately flagged by Rebecca as a personal attack. She called me crying, said I was airing family business publicly, said I was being cruel to Michael when he was grieving too. I called her back and apologized, and she accepted the apology with the kind of graciousness that made me feel smaller than I already did. My friends, the ones I confided in, started taking sides. Sarah's friend Jenna said my family was obviously terrible, but my older friend Marcus, who'd known Michael since college, said that Michael was probably just trying to protect the estate and I was being dramatic. Being dramatic. That's what they started calling me when I wanted to discuss my mother's will. When I suggested that something might be wrong, that Michael and Rebecca might have undue influence, when I spent hours online reading about elder abuse and testamentary capacity, and the ways families could manipulate vulnerable people. I became the problem. Not the will, not the money, not the fact that my siblings seemed to be rewriting history about what my mother had wanted. Me. I was the one with the issue. I was the one who couldn't let it go. I was the one making everything awkward and sad. So I stopped talking about it. But I didn't stop thinking about it. 3 months after my mother died, I had what people would call a breakdown, though I wouldn't. I call it the moment I stopped performing grief and started feeling something else entirely. It was a Tuesday. I was at a coffee shop, the one I went to every morning, and they got my order wrong. They made it with regular milk instead of oat milk, and I sat there holding this cup that wasn't what I'd asked for, wasn't what I needed, and I started crying. Not the sad kind of crying, the furious kind. Because I realized I'd been crying about the wrong thing. I'd been grieving my mother, yes, but I'd also been grieving the person I thought I was to her. The favorite. The one she'd tell secrets to. The one who understood her. But what if none of that had mattered? What if I was just another person she could leave behind, and her love had meant nothing at all? Or what if, and this was the thought that changed everything, someone had made sure she forgot me. I went home, and I didn't cry again. Instead, I opened my laptop and I started to research. Not in the panicked, desperate way I'd researched before, the way that made me feel insane and obsessive. I researched methodically, carefully, like a scientist collecting data. I made a spreadsheet. In one column, I listed every instance I could remember of my mother saying she valued me, trusted me, saw me as special. In another column, I noted the timeline. When had she said these things? Had they been recent or years ago? What had been happening in her life at those moments? I created another spreadsheet with information about my mother's health. When was she diagnosed with cancer? When did the treatment become aggressive? When did she start taking pain medication? I researched those medications. I read about side effects, about cognitive changes, about how drugs could make people suggestible. I looked up my mother's will online. Surprisingly, it was public record. I got a copy and read through it carefully. The signature was definitely hers. But who had been with her when she signed it? Who had witnessed it? The answers were in the document, Michael's business partner and the lawyer's secretary. Both of them likely knew Michael. Both of them certainly didn't know me. I started keeping a journal. Not an emotional one, not the kind of diary people use to process feelings. I kept a timeline. I noted conversations, dates, small moments that seemed insignificant at the time, but now, viewed through a different lens, seemed significant. 2 years before her death, Michael had gotten a promotion at his firm. Business had been good. He'd bought a bigger house. But 6 months after her diagnosis, he'd suddenly needed money. He'd mentioned it once at a family dinner, some investment opportunity, something time-sensitive. My mother had been sympathetic. She'd been so proud of Michael. 6 months after that, the new will had been drafted. Rebecca had been having problems with her marriage. Not serious ones, or so she'd said, but she'd mentioned money troubles. Medical bills that weren't covered by insurance. She joked about it, laughed it off, but I remembered the tension in her voice. I remembered my mother patting her hand and saying not to worry, everything would be fine. And then everything was fine. Rebecca's husband had gotten a new job, a better job, with a salary that made them suddenly comfortable. I wasn't suggesting a conspiracy. I was simply nodding that my mother had been vulnerable, that she had money, and that both my siblings had been in financial distress. These were facts. These were things that could be examined. I also started noticing other things, small things. Rebecca mentioned, during a casual phone call, that Michael had been visiting Mom more often toward the end, that he'd been checking on her regularly. I checked my phone records and found that Michael had called our mother 37 times in the 3 months before her death. I'd called her 42 times, but I had a pattern every Sunday plus occasional weekday calls. His calls had no pattern. They'd been sporadic and increasing in frequency as her health declined. What had they talked about? What had Michael been whispering in her ear during those calls? I didn't ask him, not yet. Instead, I called the hospice facility where she'd spent her last month and asked if there were any records I could access. The nurse I spoke with was kind but unhelpful. Privacy laws, she explained. But then, in a lower voice, she asked if I wanted to come by and speak with someone in person. Sometimes families have questions, she said carefully. I understood what she meant. Sometimes families had questions because something hadn't been right. On a rainy Saturday in October, I drove to my mother's house, Michael's house now, though he hadn't moved in. He was renting it out while the sale was being finalized, which meant nothing was being finalized, which meant he was living in the rental income while the paperwork moved at a lawyer's pace. I called him first. Hey, Michael, I was wondering if I could go through some of Mom's things. There are some books I'd like, and I think maybe some of her recipes. Would you be okay with that? Sure, he said easily. The place is mostly empty now. Rebecca had some movers go through and pull out the furniture. She's storing it in a climate-controlled unit. But there might be some stuff left. Just let yourself in. Just let yourself in. Because after 34 years, my mother's house was mine to walk through like a trespasser, looking for evidence. The house was cold, empty in a way that made me feel the absence of my mother like a physical thing. The living room, where we'd spent countless hours talking, was bare except for the built-in bookshelves. The kitchen, where she'd taught me to cook, had been stripped of personality, just white walls and stainless steel appliances. I went straight to her office. It was the smallest room in the house, what had originally been designed as a closet or storage area, but my mother had claimed it decades ago as her space. She kept her correspondence here, her financial documents, the small desk where she'd written letters and paid bills. Michael had mostly left it alone. Probably because there was nothing of monetary value to steal. I started methodically searching. The desk drawers held the normal detritus of a person's life. Bills, bank statements, correspondence with utility companies. I photographed everything relevant. I found her insurance documents, her mortgage statements, her credit card bills. Nothing unusual. The filing cabinet was next. I worked through it file by file, medical records, property tax statements, correspondence with her accountant, and then in a folder marked personal, I found letters. They were from Michael. They were dated over the course of 2 years, starting about 3 years before her death. I opened the first one. Dear Mom, it began. I've been thinking about some of our recent conversations, and I wanted to put my thoughts in writing to make sure we're on the same page. I know you've talked about updating your will, and I want to make sure that you understand the tax implications of different distribution options. As your son who understands financial matters, I think it's important that I help you make informed decisions." I read through the letters carefully. There was nothing overtly manipulative. Michael wasn't threatening or demanding. Instead, he was helping. He was concerned. He was only looking out for Mom's best interests. But each letter was a suggestion that the house should go to him because he'd understand the maintenance and could handle the paperwork. That the investment portfolio should go to Rebecca because she had children to think about. That I was creative and artistic, but perhaps not as practical with financial matters. The letters painted a very specific picture of me, flawed, talented, but ultimately incapable of managing money. And the letters painted my siblings as competent, responsible, worthy of trust. I photographed every single letter. The last place I checked was the bookshelf. My mother had kept her favorites in her office, books with broken spines and underlined passages. I was pulling them down one by one when something fell out of an older book, a leather-bound copy of Jane Eyre that I'd given her for her birthday years ago. It was an envelope. My name was written on it in my mother's handwriting. My hands were shaking as I opened it. The letter inside was dated 2 weeks before she died. 2 weeks when the pain medication was strong and her mind was cloudy but still present, still her. "My dear Sarah," it began. "If you're reading this, I need to tell you something important. I've been thinking about our conversations, and I realize that I haven't been entirely honest with you. Not intentionally, I would never hurt you intentionally. But I think other people have influenced me. I think Michael has been helping me with my will, and I think that his help might have been more about his interests than mine. I'm writing this because I'm not entirely sure anymore what I really want, and I don't want you to believe that my final will represents my true wishes." My mother's handwriting deteriorated as the letter went on, becoming shakier and less controlled. "I love you, you know that, don't you? You're my heart, and I'm sorry if my will makes you think otherwise. I'm sorry if they've convinced me to give away my life in a way that makes you question our love. Please don't let this destroy your relationship with your siblings, but also please don't accept their version of what I wanted. There's a locked box in the safe. Michael thinks it's empty, but it isn't." There was an address for a safety deposit box at a bank downtown, and a key. Taped to the back of the letter was a small brass key. I read the letter 3 times, and then I sat on the floor of my dead mother's office and cried, but not sad tears. Angry tears, vindicated tears, the tears of someone who had been right all along. The bank was closing in 40 minutes when I walked through the doors. I must have looked unhinged. I was still wearing the same clothes I'd worn to search the house. My hair was wet from the rain, and I was holding a death grip on a small brass key and a 34-year-old letter from a dead woman. The banker didn't question me. I had the key, I had my mother's name, I had her death certificate, and I had a power of attorney document that Michael had sent me for estate matters. He probably hadn't realized that power of attorney was still technically valid until the estate was fully settled. The safety deposit box was in the vault, in a wall of identical boxes. Mine was small, about the size of a shoebox. The banker inserted her key and my key simultaneously, and we opened it together. Inside were documents. Not a new will, though there was a draft of one. A newer will, dated 3 months before her death, written in a shaky hand that looked like it could have been my mother's during a good pain medication day. This will left the house to Michael and Rebecca, but it left the investment portfolio to me. It left the savings account to all 3 of us equally. And it left a personal note, explaining that she wanted me to have the resources to pursue the life I wanted, the gallery or museum or whatever dreams I'd been nursing. "You deserve to build something beautiful," the note said, "not inherited from me, but created by you." But this will wasn't filed with the court. Instead, there were letters. Correspondence between my mother and an attorney named Dorothy Chen, dating back 6 months. Dorothy Chen was not the lawyer who'd handled the official will. That was Mr. Henderson. Dorothy Chen was a different attorney, one my mother had apparently consulted privately. The letters explained everything. My mother had gone to see Dorothy Chen because she was concerned about undue influence. She'd explicitly mentioned her worry that Michael was advising her on financial matters. She'd expressed confusion about her own will and asked Dorothy Chen to help her understand her legal options. Dorothy Chen had explained that my mother could write a new will, but that courts might look unfavorably on multiple wills, especially if it appeared the testator was being manipulated. Dorothy Chen had suggested that my mother write a clear statement of her intentions, have it witnessed, and document everything. The draft will was that statement, but my mother, in the end, had chosen not to file it. Instead, she'd chosen to leave it with a letter to me, hoping that I would discover it. Why hadn't she filed it? Why hadn't she made her intentions official? The last document in the box was a handwritten note, dated just days before her death. "I'm afraid," my mother had written. "I'm afraid that if I change my will now, Michael will know I've figured out what he's doing. And I'm afraid that if he knows I know, he'll stop coming to visit. I'm afraid of being alone. So I'm leaving this for Sarah because I think she'll understand. I think she'll know what to do. And if she doesn't, at least she'll know she was loved. That will have to be enough." The banker asked if I was all right. I hadn't realized I was crying again. I spent the next week doing nothing. I went to work, I came home, I moved through my life like an automaton. But inside, something had fundamentally shifted. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger was a hot thing, a thing that made you do reckless things. I was past anger. I was in the territory of cold, clear knowledge. I knew what my siblings had done. I knew that they'd manipulated a dying woman. I knew that they'd exploited her love for them and her fear of being alone. I knew that they were counting on me staying quiet, staying hurt, staying small. I made a plan. The plan had 3 parts. First, I would gather evidence. Second, I would build a case so airtight that no court could possibly rule against me. Third, I would make sure that my siblings understood exactly what they'd done, and I would do it in a way that cost them something. Not money. That would be too easy. I wanted them to lose something they actually cared about. I hired a lawyer. Not Mr. Henderson, a different lawyer, a woman named Janet Park who specialized in estate disputes and had a reputation for being thorough to the point of relentlessness. I brought her the documents from the safety deposit box. I showed her the letters Michael had written. I told her about the draft will and my mother's signed statement about undue influence. Janet listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she leaned back in her chair and smiled. "This is good," she said. "This is very good. Your mother essentially documented the entire problem. She handed you the case on a silver platter." "Can we win?" I asked. "Yes," Janet said. "The question is how badly they lose." We filed a petition to challenge the will on the grounds of undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity due to medication and pain. We attached all of my mother's documents as evidence. We requested that the court examine the draft will and consider it as evidence of my mother's true intentions. Michael's response was immediate. He called me. "What the fuck are you doing?" he said, and that was when I knew he'd been expecting this, some version of it, but had thought I wouldn't have the courage to do it. "I'm following Mom's wishes," I said quietly. "You're tearing this family apart. You're destroying Rebecca. She has 2 children, Sarah. 2 children who now have to listen to their mother cry because their aunt is trying to steal their inheritance." "I'm not stealing anything," I said. "I'm claiming what Mom actually wanted me to have." "That's not what Mom wanted. That's what you want." "No," I said. "I have a letter. I have a draft will. I have 6 months of correspondence with an attorney discussing undue influence. What do you have?" He was silent. "I have her love," he said finally. "I was the one who was there. I was the one checking on her. I was the one making sure she was taken care of." "You were the one making sure she felt indebted to you," I said. "There's a difference." He hung up. The next person to contact me was Rebecca. She didn't yell. She did something worse. She cried. She told me that she'd never meant to hurt me, that Michael had just mentioned some things to Mom during conversations, and she'd had no idea that it was even a big deal. "We just thought you needed more time to figure yourself out," she said. "We thought the money would help us, and then maybe later we could help you." "You never asked me what I needed," I said. Because we already knew. You needed. You don't get to decide what I need. That's not your choice to make. After we hung up, I called Janet. They're going to try to settle, I told her. Definitely, Janet said. The question is whether we accept it. We didn't accept their first settlement offer. It was for half the estate. They'd split the difference, essentially, and everyone would walk away partially satisfied but mostly resentful. No, I told Janet. I don't want to split the difference. I want them to understand what they did. That's going to require a trial, Janet warned me. I know. And a trial is going to be ugly. They're going to say you're unstable. They're going to argue that your mother was just being kind in her original will. They're going to try to make you look like a greedy, ungrateful daughter. Let them, I said. But I wasn't going to make it easy for them. While the lawsuit was moving through the courts, I continued gathering evidence. It was a different kind of evidence than what I had. I was looking for pattern, for consistency, for the small traces of manipulation that lived in the mundane details of family life. I obtained Michael's phone records through a subpoena. I looked at the dates and times of his calls to our mother. I cross-referenced them with her medical records. Every significant call happened right before a doctor's appointment or a medication change. He was calling to coach her, I was certain of it. To tell her what to expect, what to say, what to remember about her own wishes. I interviewed the hospice nurses. They had records of visits, notes about our mother's mental state. One nurse mentioned that Michael had been very involved with her medications, that he'd asked many questions about side effects and how they might affect decision-making. He seemed genuinely concerned, the nurse said. But now you mention it, it's a little odd that he was so focused on the cognitive side effects. I found the bank statements from my mother's accounts in the 6 months before her death. There was a large withdrawal, $50,000, that went to an account that initially looked anonymous, but through careful research and a good financial forensics expert, I traced back to a real estate investment group that Michael was involved with. Michael had borrowed money from our mother, without telling her it was a loan, without signing any paperwork. He'd just borrowed it and then let her die, and then assumed he'd inherited enough money to never pay it back. I found emails between Michael and the real estate group discussing the investment. They mentioned my mother by name. She was generous, one email said. We're grateful for her contribution to the venture. They didn't know it was supposed to be a loan. Michael had never told them it was a loan. And I found something else. In Rebecca's house, during one of those monthly dinners, I saw something on her kitchen counter. A hospital bill, partially visible under some mail. I photographed it without her knowing. Later, when I had access to it through the discovery process in the lawsuit, it showed that Rebecca had taken a $40,000 loan against our mother's home without our mother's knowledge or permission. She'd done it to pay for her husband's student loans, to consolidate their debt. And our mother had paid the interest on that loan for the last 2 years of her life, money flowing out of her accounts in small increments while she had no idea why. When I showed these documents to Janet, she leaned back in her chair and whistled. This is bigger than undue influence, she said. This is fraud, this is theft, this is elder abuse. What do we do? I asked. Everything, Janet said. We do everything. The trial started on a Monday in February, 8 months after my mother's death, 16 months after Michael had written his first letter to her about updating her will. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, not like the ones on TV. It was just a room with wood paneling and a judge and a court reporter and my siblings sitting on the opposite side of the room with their lawyers. Michael looked smaller than he had in my memory. He was still handsome, still put together, but there was something deflated about him. He knew he was going to lose. I could see it in the way he held his shoulders. Rebecca looked destroyed. She'd been crying. I could see the puffiness around her eyes, the way her makeup couldn't quite hide the damage. She kept trying to catch my eye, like she wanted to appeal to some sisterly understanding that had never really existed. The judge, a woman named Judith Morrison, was in her 60s, with steel-gray hair and the kind of face that suggested she'd seen every version of this story before and had no patience for any of it. The prosecution went first. Janet stood and explained the case. She was methodical and calm, laying out the facts like a scientist describing an experiment. Here is the original will. Here is the draft will. Here are the letters from Michael to the mother, each one subtly pushing her toward a specific outcome. Here are the letters from the mother to her attorney, expressing concern about undue influence. Here is the evidence that Michael borrowed money from his mother without her knowledge. Here is the evidence that Rebecca did the same. Then came the witnesses. Dorothy Chen, the attorney who'd worked with my mother, testified about their conversations. She described my mother as lucid and concerned about Michael's influence. She explained that my mother had been genuinely confused about her own intentions, that she'd felt torn between her children and unable to see clearly what was happening to her. She wanted to make everyone happy, Dorothy Chen said, but she also wanted to be fair to her daughter. Those two desires were in conflict, and I think that conflict was making her question everything she wanted to do. The hospice nurses testified next. They described my mother's mental state. They talked about how certain medications could cause confusion and suggestibility. They talked about how Michael had been present for many decisions, always helpful, always there to remind our mother of her wishes. I remember one time, one nurse said, when your mother expressed doubt about her will. She said something like, "I'm not sure this is right," and your brother said, "Mom, don't worry, we talked about this. This is what you wanted." And then she seemed to accept it, but I always wondered if she was really accepting it or if she was just too tired to argue. The financial forensics expert testified about the money trail, how my mother's bank account had slowly been depleted, how she'd taken out a loan against her house, a loan she may not have fully understood, how $50,000 had gone to Michael's investment group while she was taking pain medication that affected her judgment. And then I testified. I sat in the witness stand, and I told the story of my relationship with my mother. I told them about the monthly visits and the phone calls and the conversations where she'd told me I was her favorite. I told them about her last clear moment, when she'd asked me to promise I was strong, and I'd promised without understanding what she was asking me to promise. Janet asked me to describe the discovery of the safety deposit box. I walked through it methodically, the searching through the house, the finding of the envelope with my name on it, the reading of my mother's admission that she was uncertain about her own will, that she thought she'd been influenced. "Did your mother love you?" Janet asked. "Yes," I said. "I know she did." "Do you think she would have wanted you to have nothing?" "No," I said. "I don't think she would have. I think she was confused and scared, and she was influenced by people who needed things from her. And I think she was ashamed of that, so she left me the truth instead of letting the lie stand." Then came Michael's lawyer. He was younger than I expected, aggressive in a way that seemed calculated. "Isn't it possible," he asked, "that your mother simply felt that your siblings were more financially responsible than you, that she made a rational choice about who should receive her money?" "It's possible," I said, "if that's what she'd actually chosen, but she didn't. She left a draft will and a letter saying she'd been influenced. Those are her actual words, not my interpretation." "Your mother was a woman who loved her children equally," he said. "Isn't it possible that the draft will and letter were actually signs of confusion, and that her original will represented her true wishes?" "No," I said. "I don't think that's possible, because my mother documented her own confusion. She documented the influence. She didn't leave a confused letter. She left a clear letter explaining the source of her confusion. Those are different things." He didn't have a good response to that. Michael testified in his own defense. He said he'd only been trying to help. He said our mother had appreciated his financial advice. He said he'd never told her what to do with her money, he'd only provided information. When Janet cross-examined him, she asked him about the letters. "These letters where you explain the tax implications of different will distributions," she said. "Did you ever discuss with your mother that you might have a financial interest in which distribution option she chose?" "I didn't have a financial interest," Michael said. "I was her son and I was trying to help." "You didn't have a financial interest, even though you borrowed $50,000 from her accounts. with no documentation and no plan to repay it. Michael's face went white. "That wasn't a loan," he said quietly. "That was a gift." "Did she tell you it was a gift?" "She said I could have it." "When did she say that?" It was during a phone call." "Do you have any documentation of this gift? Any email? Any message?" "No." Just her word, during a time when she was on pain medication that affected her judgment. "She knew what she was doing," Michael said, but he didn't sound convinced. Rebecca's testimony was shorter. She cried on the stand. She said she'd been desperate and scared about her marriage, and our mother had wanted to help. She said she'd taken the loan because she needed it, but she'd planned to pay it back. Janet showed her a document. "Is this your promissory note?" I planned to get one." "Planned but didn't." "It was complicated." "Yes," Janet said. "It is very complicated when you borrow $50,000 from your elderly mother and never actually establish an agreement to repay it." Rebecca cried harder, and I felt something unexpected. A flicker of pity, because Rebecca was weak in a way that Michael wasn't. Michael had taken what he wanted and felt entitled to it. Rebecca had taken what she wanted and felt guilty, but not guilty enough to return it. The judge took 2 weeks to make her decision. 2 weeks of waiting. 2 weeks of calling Janet and asking if she thought we'd won, and Janet saying the same thing over and over. "The evidence is strong. We did everything right. Now we wait." The courtroom was fuller the second time. Michael and Rebecca had brought supporters, family friends. I sat alone, and that was its own kind of statement. Judge Morrison read her decision from the bench. She talked about the nature of undue influence. She talked about the evidence of my mother's own concerns about her judgment. She talked about the contradictory wills and what they revealed about my mother's true intentions. "The original will," she said, "appears to have been created during a period when the testator was subject to significant influence from parties with financial interests in the outcome. The testator expressed clear concerns about this influence through contemporaneous communications with an attorney. The draft will, combined with the personal letter from the testator to her daughter, demonstrates the testator's desire to change her previous dispositions. Therefore, I find that the original will is invalid due to undue influence, and the draft will should be recognized as the true expression of the testator's wishes." She looked directly at me. "The court recognizes that this case represents a failure of family members to honor the autonomy and wishes of a vulnerable person. The testator attempted to protect herself by creating a record of the pressure being applied to her. The court finds this request to be reasonable, and this decision to be in accordance with the testator's true wishes." Michael's face was completely blank. Rebecca was crying openly. Their lawyers were already talking in low voices, already planning the appeal that everyone knew they'd lose. The settlement was $1.3 million divided as follows. The house would be sold, and the proceeds divided equally among the three of us. The investment portfolio would go to me. The savings account would be divided among the three of us with equal shares. My mother's personal effects would come to me, and Michael and Rebecca would be liable for court costs and attorney's fees. More than that, the court ordered a financial accounting. Michael and Rebecca would have to account for every penny my mother had given them, and any that was deemed improper would be treated as debt against their inheritance. When it was all calculated, my cut would be approximately $600,000 more than the original will had given me. But that wasn't why I'd done it. The aftermath was quiet in a way that surprised me. Michael didn't call. He immediately appealed the decision, but through his lawyer, not directly. Rebecca tried to call me a few times, but I didn't answer. Our family was essentially done, not dramatically, not with screaming or angry ultimatums, just done. The way families end when trust has been broken so completely that there's no fixing it. 2 months after the verdict, Michael's investment group collapsed. The property venture my mother had funded turned out to have significant fraud at the corporate level. Investors lost money. A lot of money. Michael lost more than most because he'd been involved in the management. By the time the SEC was done investigating, he'd lost his law license and faced the possibility of personal financial liability. I didn't do that. The federal government did, but the timing was almost poetic. Michael had stolen from our mother to fund an investment scheme that was itself stealing from other people. The universe has a sense of justice, sometimes. Rebecca's marriage ended. Not because of the lawsuit, though it certainly didn't help. She confessed to her husband that she'd borrowed money from our mother without telling him, and he apparently couldn't get past the violation of trust. They divorced, quietly and without contest. Rebecca moved back to her parents' neighborhood, and started working at a gallery that one of her friends owned. It was less impressive than her previous life, but it seemed to make her genuinely happy. A year after the trial, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Rebecca. No return address, just a cream-colored envelope with my name written in her handwriting. "Dear Sarah," it began, "I know you won't want to hear from me, but I need to say this. I've been in therapy trying to understand why I made the choices I made. My therapist asked me to write letters to the people I've wronged, even if I never send them. But I'm sending this one. I want you to know that what we did to you was wrong. What Michael did was wrong, and I was complicit." I told myself I was just going along with what Michael wanted, but the truth is, I didn't care enough about you to stand up for you. I knew that the money didn't matter to me the way it clearly mattered to him, but I let him convince me that you would figure it out, that you were stronger than you looked, that you didn't really need the money anyway. Those were lies I told myself to feel less guilty. And then when you won and we lost, I thought it was the worst thing that could happen. But now I see that it might have been the best thing. It shattered the person I was pretending to be, and maybe that's good. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect anything from you, but I wanted you to know that I see what happened now, and I'm ashamed. Love, Rebecca. I read the letter 3 times, and then I put it in a drawer and I didn't respond. Some things can't be fixed by letters. Some things can only be fixed by the kind of honesty that comes too late. 1 year after my mother's death, I did something I'd been planning for months. I found a small gallery space in the Pearl District, the neighborhood in Portland, where the young, creative types were starting to congregate. It was narrow and deep, with white walls and natural light from the front. It was perfect. I used my inheritance to lease it, to renovate it, to launch it as a proper gallery. Not one where I just helped other artists show their work, but one where I curated, where I made decisions, where I had control. The first exhibition was about loss. I called it The Sealed Envelope. I displayed my mother's artwork, things she'd made years ago when she'd thought she might be an artist before she'd decided she couldn't do anything really well, so why try? I displayed photographs of her throughout her life. I displayed excerpts from her letters to me. I displayed the draft will and a copy of the letter she'd left in the safety deposit box. And I displayed a simple piece of text on the wall in large letters. My mother documented the truth because she couldn't speak it while she lived. This exhibition honors the people who find the courage to speak truth, even when speaking means losing everything. The exhibition was written up in the local paper. There was a whole article about the lawsuit, the family betrayal, the court case that had shocked Portland's legal community. But what interested people most was the art, the history, the story of a woman trying to protect her daughter from beyond the grave. People came, lots of people, other people with their own family stories, their own betrayals, their own sealed envelopes containing truths they weren't sure anyone would ever believe. I became known in Portland's art community as the curator who understood loss, the one who could display pain in a way that didn't exploit it, but honored it. Other artists wanted to work with me. Other galleries wanted to partner with me. 6 months after opening, I hired my first full-time employee, 2 people by the end of the year. And sometime during that first year, I realized I'd stopped being angry at my siblings. Not forgave them. I didn't forgive them. Forgiveness implies they'd asked for it, and they hadn't. Michael was too busy dealing with the collapse of his legal career and his financial schemes. Rebecca was too busy rebuilding whatever life she could have. Neither of them had come to me and asked for forgiveness. But I'd stopped being defined by my anger at them. They'd become minor characters in my story instead of the central plot. And that, I think, is the real revenge. Not the money, not the lawsuit, not the destroyed reputations. The real revenge is building a life that doesn't require them to be wrong for it to be right. Epilogue, the quiet ending. On the 2-year anniversary of my mother's death, I returned to the cemetery. It was a cold March day, the kind that looks like spring but feels like winter. I brought flowers, not roses or lilies, but wildflowers, the kind my mother had always loved because they grew without anyone's permission. I stood in front of her grave for a while without saying anything. What was there to say? I'd already said it all in the gallery, in the trial, in the decision to live well instead of living small. "Thank you," I finally said, "for the truth, for trying to protect me even at the end, for knowing I would figure it out." I thought about the sealed envelope, about how my mother had hidden her true wishes inside a book of Jane Eyre, a novel about a woman who'd been treated unjustly and had chosen to walk away and build her own life. My mother had known me well enough to know exactly what message I needed to receive. I thought about Michael, teaching in a private college now, waiting to see if he'd face criminal charges. I thought about Rebecca, working at the gallery, occasionally running into people who recognized her from the newspaper articles and looked at her with pity. Neither of them had what they wanted, but neither of them had destroyed me in the process of trying. I'd won the lawsuit, yes, but more than that, I'd learned something about myself. I'd learned that I was capable of quiet strategy, of patience, of building a case instead of just building a narrative, of being the kind of woman who could look at evidence and see the truth, even when that truth hurt. My mother had believed in my strength. She just had to document it in an envelope to make me believe it too. 3 days later, I got an email from a curator at the Portland Art Museum. They wanted to partner with my gallery on a series of exhibitions about family and loss, and the ways art helps us process the things we can't speak aloud. I read the email twice, and then I called Janet Park. "Hey," I said when she answered. "Thank you for everything. I wanted to tell you that I'm doing this gallery, and I'm going to donate a portion of the proceeds to a foundation that helps people challenge elder abuse." "That's perfect," Janet said. "Your mother would be proud." "I think so too," I said. After I hung up, I sat for a while thinking about the story I'd been living. How it had started as a tragedy and become a mystery and ended as something that looked a lot like triumph, though it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like peace. And I realized that the sealed envelope my mother had left me wasn't just documents and evidence. It was permission. Permission to be angry, yes, but also permission to channel that anger into something productive. Permission to win not by destroying my family, but by building something they could never take from me. I thought about my mother often after that, not with the particular ache that comes from fresh loss, but with the kind of gentle remembrance that comes from knowing someone truly. She had been flawed like everyone. She'd been manipulated like many. But in her final clarity, she'd chosen to trust me. And I'd been worth that trust. That, in the end, was the real justice.